Hello everyone. In this lesson, we will build a reusable block that we can use to create column layouts throughout our page. Let's dive right in and get started. So in this lesson, we want to focus on this content. If we look at our design file, we see that that content should use a two-column layout. So basically, we want this content here to be placed next to the image. And what do these two columns belong to? They belong to a row, right? So if we think of a spreadsheet, this would be column A, this would be column B, and they are grouped together in a row. So in our HTML, let's wrap all of this content in a new div that has a class of row. We can find that content in our HTML by searching for how we got started. Okay, so here is that image. Let's open our div and give it a class of row. And then if we scroll down a bit, after this paragraph, let's close that div that we just opened. And let's be sure to indent all of the content within that new div. Next, let's go ahead and create a new CSS file for our row class. So in app, assets, styles, and then modules, let's create a new file. Let's name this new file underscore row.css. Let's create a new class and then go ahead and save this file. And before we forget, let's go into our main styles.css file and import this new file underscore row. Go ahead and save that. Next, let's wrap each section of content that we want to be a column in their own divs. So in our HTML, within our row, let's create two new divs. Let's cut and paste the image into the first div. And let's cut and paste from the heading level 2 down to this paragraph into the second div. Paste it in and be sure to get rid of these empty lines. All right, so now the question becomes, what should the class name be for these two new divs that we just created? We know that they belong to the row block, so their class name should begin with row and then underscore underscore. But what do we actually want to name each of these column elements? Well, let's look at our design file for just a moment. Why don't we go ahead and think of our row in terms of a 12-column grid? So this image, or our first column, looks like it's taking up about 1/3 of the width of the row. Or to put that into context of the 12-column grid, what is 1/3 of 12? The answer is 4. And it just so happens that it looks like this image column is taking up 4 of the 12-column grid bars. Our second column looks like it's taking up about 2/3 of the available width. And what is 2/3 of 12? The answer is 8. And it looks like this column is taking up 8 of our 12-column grid bars. So we could call this layout a 4-8 split. So over in our HTML, why don't we just give this element a class of row underscore underscore 4 and give this column a class of row underscore underscore 8. Let's go ahead and save this file and jump over to our row.css file and write a bit of CSS to make the column layout come to life. So let's begin with the underscore underscore 4 class. Let's tell it to float to the left. Let's give it a width. And let's actually open our calculators. If we think of our row's available width as 100%, and then divide that up amongst our 12-column grid, so 100 divided by 12, that means that each one of our 12 grid bars is 8 1/3%. So for our 4 class, we can just take that 8 1/3 and multiply it by 4. And no surprise, that gives us 33.33, which is what we expect considering we wanted this class to take up 1/3 of the available width. So let's go with 33.33%. All right, let's create the rule for our underscore underscore 8 class. Float it to the left, give it a width, and we don't need a calculator. If this is 1/3, then we know that 2/3 would be 66.66%. Let's save this file and check the browser. So we do see two columns. This content and the image are now side by side, but we also see a problem. The blue background feature section has moved up and is now sitting behind our content. This is because we forgot to clear our floats. When we float an element, we take it out of the normal flow of the page. And in this instance, our row div only has two direct children, the two columns. And if both of these elements have been taken out of the flow of the page, it's almost as if our main row div has no idea how tall it should be. Because as far as it's concerned in terms of sizing and styling, it thinks that it's empty. So for example, we could tell the main row div to have a background color of yellow, and if we save this and check the browser, we don't even see 1 pixel of yellow anywhere. Now there are several different ways to fix this. Let's look at the sloppy, not ideal way first. So in our HTML, right before the main row div ends, we can create another element and give it a class of clearMe. The key here is that this element comes after all of its floated siblings. So let's save this file and jump into our CSS. Let's create a rule that targets that element, and let's say clear left or clear both. So if we save this and check the browser, we see that that got the job done. The main parent row div now knows how tall it should be because all of its floated children have been cleared. Now the reason I called that the sloppy or not ideal way of clearing our floats is because we added an empty element to our markup. And whenever possible, you should avoid empty elements that only exist for styling purposes. So let's delete this, save this file, and jump back into our CSS file and delete this clearMe rule. And let me show you a more ideal way of clearing our floats. So up at the top of this row rule, let's create a new selector. We can say : after to create a bit of pseudo or fake content with CSS. So let's say content, double quotes with nothing in between the quotes. And then let's tell this empty fake space to be set to clear both. And for a bit of added extra browser support, we can also just say display table. So this CSS selector will add this blank space after all of the content in the main row div. Or in other words, it will create that content right where we used to have our empty div. So if we go ahead and save this and check the browser, we see that our floats are still cleared and we got to keep our HTML clean. Now let's clean up a little bit. So we didn't actually want the background color to be yellow. Let's delete that. And this code that we used to clear the floats should probably be moved into a mixin, so we can easily reuse this code whenever we want. So let's go ahead and cut this code into our clipboard. And within app, assets, styles, and then the base folder, let's open up mixins.css. Let's go to the bottom and say @ define mixin, and let's call this mixin clearfix. And then just go ahead and paste your clipboard. All right, looks good. Let's save this mixins file. And back in row.css, now we can just say mixin clearfix. Let's save this file and check the browser. Looks good. But now I'm noticing that the two columns butt up directly against each other. And I think it would look a lot better if there was a gutter or margin between the two. And if we look at the design file, we see that there is indeed supposed to be a margin. Now there might be situations where we do want our columns to touch like this. So I think the best way to handle this is to go into our HTML and on our main row div, give it a modifier class of row -- gutters. So by default, we will not have gutters or margins, and if we want them, we just add this modifier class. Next, let's write a bit of CSS so that if this modifier class is used, a bit of horizontal padding will be added to all of the columns. And that will create the margin or gutters effect that we are looking for. So in our CSS, let's create a rule for that gutters modifier, but we don't want to select or style the actual parent row div. We want to select all of its direct children, or in other words, all of the columns. So we can use the greater than symbol to select all direct children that use a tag of div, and then we can just say padding right, 65 pixels. So let's save this and check the browser. Now there's no need to panic, but we see that our column layout broke. So our second column is now getting pushed to a second line. And this is because the padding values that we just added upset the arithmetic that we set up earlier. We cannot let the combined width of our columns be more than 100%. Otherwise, they won't be able to both fit on a single line. Now by default, web browsers calculate the true width of an element by taking the declared width and then adding on any padding or borders. So clearly this value plus this value plus an extra 130 pixels is more than 100% of the available horizontal space. However, we can change the way that web browsers calculate the true width of elements. If we say box sizing border box, web browsers will actually honor our declared width values. Our padding will still be applied, but it won't affect the calculated width values. So let's go ahead and save this and check out the browser. And we are back in business. Now I don't know about you, but this box sizing border box way of calculating width values makes sense to me. I prefer it over the browser default. Now in recent years, something that a lot of web developers have been doing is applying this globally to all elements on the page. So for example, let's delete this line, and within app assets styles and in the base folder, let's open up global.css, create a new rule where the selector is the star or asterisk, meaning we want to select every single element on the page, and let's say box sizing border box. Go ahead and save. So with that in place, managing our width values just got a lot easier. We set that property once in the global file and we can forget about it. At this point, our column layout is shaping up nicely. There are just a few more things that I want to fine tune. So for example, there is currently a margin or gutter here and here. Now you might not be able to notice the one that I am currently highlighting. So let me make it obvious by jumping into our text editor in row.css and giving the main parent row div a background color of yellow. So we obviously want a margin or gutter between the two columns, but we definitely do not need a gutter or margin on this far right edge. That's a waste of space. Now we created these margins or gutters by applying padding right to each column. We did this so even if we have a row that has 3 or 4 or 5 columns, there will automatically be a gutter between each of them. So the question becomes, how do we remove this final gutter on the end? Our first instinct might be to select the last column in a row and tell it to have 0 padding. But doing that would actually affect the ratio of our columns, right? So currently, this column is exactly 1/3 of the available width, and this column is exactly 2/3. But if we told the final column to not have any padding, it would no longer be exactly 2/3. So let me show you how I like to handle this situation. We can counteract this padding right by selecting the main parent row with a modifier class of gutters and giving it a negative right margin that matches the padding value. So we can say negative 65 pixels. The second column still has the gutter or margin that we need to get rid of, so clearly we are not done yet. However, the negative margin has made the row in general 65 pixels wider than it should be. What do I mean by that? Well, the row is supposed to be constrained by the width of our wrapper div, right? So for example, if we open up wrapper.css and give it a background color of green, you can see that the yellow of our row element is protruding outside the right edge of the wrapper. And this is thanks to the negative right margin. So now, Within wrapper.css, we can simply say overflow hidden. Go ahead and save this. And the negative margin still exists. It's where the padding or gutter for this second column is, but because we told the wrapper to have overflow hidden, we can't see it. So in other words, we can remove these silly background colors that we were using for demonstration purposes. And we now have a very clean column layout. Now before we bring this lesson to a close, let's see how things look on a mobile or small screen. Let me scroll up a little bit. And we see that the column layout looks very odd on a small screen. There just isn't enough horizontal space to have multiple columns sit side by side. Let's go ahead and adjust this so that small screens use a single column layout. So on small screens, we want each section to use the full available width and simply stack on top of each other vertically. But we do want to maintain the multiple column layout on larger screens. So why don't we do this? Over in our HTML, let's adjust the class names on our column elements. So for example, we don't want this element to use 4 of our 12 column grid bars for all screen sizes. On a small screen, we want this element to use the full available horizontal width. So why don't we do this? Why don't we adjust this name to say row __ medium 4. And this way we will adjust our CSS to use media queries. So only if a screen is considered medium or larger will we apply the width and tell it to float to the left. Let's do the same thing to this element. So medium 8. And then over in our row.css file, let's simply change the name for these two rules and then wrap them in a media query. So let's change this to medium 4 and medium 8. And now we can use a media query mixin. So we can say mixin at medium. So only when a screen is medium or larger do we want these rules to be applied. So let's just cut and paste these into that mixin. Let's go ahead and save this file and check out the browser. Looks good. So on a small screen, the image takes up the full available width, and so does the section below it. And we still maintain the 2-column layout on larger screens. And that will bring this lesson to a close. In our next lesson, we will adjust this typography to match the design file. We will also add a bit of much needed vertical spacing between these two images. And we will also convert both of these images to become responsive images. Let's keep rolling along, and I will see you in the next lesson.